Horse postures with lines of force. This presentation is to review the physical balance of the horse through observing postures, which tells us about the biomechanical function of the spine. So in training for optimal balance, I look at mental balance, emotional balance, physical balance. This particular presentation is about the physical balance of the horse. It applies whether you're riding or doing groundwork, basic handling. It's just a generalized overview of various postures associated with imbalance and what it looks like to have basic balance, what that posture looks like, and then even higher balance. So let's get started. So this page you can review. It goes over the 5 basic functions of the spine and what each function, as it changes, how it affects the feeling the rider receives in the saddle. So alignment would be all the bones of the spine properly aligned for the stability in a healthy range of motion between the tail and the pole, all the way through the entire spine. It's not mechanically, geometrically straight, but from the rider's perspective, when we have the proper mechanical alignment of the spine, what we get is a geometrically straight line of force. So we feel the center line of the horse geometrically straight when the spine is in a healthy alignment, particularly the cervical spine to the thoracic spine. Rotation is another mechanical function that we feel when it's stabilized and upright. We feel the horse's back as level. Rotation is basically the dorsal tips of the spine rolling left to right. So that can happen for various reasons, and when it happens, the opposite back muscles, if the bones rotate dorsal tips left, then the right back muscles will severely contract, and the rider will be pulled down to the left and pushed up on the right. When rotation is stabilized in the horse's spine, we get the feeling of levelness. That's pretty intimately related to also the feeling of straightness, and both are related to steering, staying on a path of travel, steering from the saddle, as well as lateral work. So then we have longitudinal extension, which I refer to just as the posture of extension, meaning the whole spine is basically pushing down towards the ventral side. Extension and flexion are just general terms. Extension meaning the bones of a joint are moving farther apart. Flexion means the bones of the joint are coming closer together. When we talk about longitudinal extension, or what we just call spinal extension, or the horse's in extension, what that means is the bones on the ventral side of the spine are coming farther apart, which puts the bones on the dorsal side of the spine closer together. The side effect of extension, which is actually, it's an instinctual posture. You can think of it as the posture of instinct. When a horse goes into fight or flight, extension becomes the use of the spine. The posture is called extension, and the horse gains rapid power for fight or flight. But if they're working in that posture or in that function or that use of their spine with a rider on board, the feeling the rider has is a lot of instability in the saddle. And over the long term, it will create instability throughout the horse's movement in general. Longitudinal flexion is the opposite of longitudinal extension. Longitudinal flexion, again, we're talking about the spine as one unit. The ventral side of the spine, the bones are coming closer together. So on the dorsal side of the spine, the bones are coming farther apart. This is also what we call a lifted back, rounding, when the horse is round or the horse is engaged. The horse is lifting, The horse is carrying itself, all those sort of terms that we use to express high balance or good balance is technically, mechanically, longitudinal flexion. So that's how I refer to it. The feeling we get when the horse is going in flexion, just like in extension, we don't necessarily feel the dropping of the spine or the back falling downward. We feel the side effect of instability. And in longitudinal flexion, we don't always necessarily feel the lift right at first. That might be a higher level of flexion. The first thing we might feel, and what we should feel for sure in the highest mode of flexion, is stability. So that's how the rider can read that a little bit easier, because the obvious changes between longitudinal extension and longitudinal flexion is the saddle either becoming less stable, harder for the rider to sit still, or more stable, easier for the rider to sit still. And then the final function I have is lateral flexion. And again, that would be flexion on side to side on the spine, the medial side or lateral sides of the spine. And again, on one side where the bones are coming closer together, we would say if their bones are coming closer together on the left side of the spine, that would be left lateral flexion. And the opposite side of the spine on the right would obviously be going into extension. So this is what we call lateral bending. Bending a horse is lateral flexion. But when lateral flexion is actually done properly, we don't feel the center line or the alignment of the horse on a curve inside their body. We still should feel a straight line from nose to tail. The pole will be flexed left or right, which puts the entire spine in the question of lateral bending. So in lateral work, or even on a circle, the horse still feels a straight alignment of the entire spine. The rotation is controlled to be level. When we get proper lateral flexion, it always is coupled with the appropriate rotation. And when we put those pieces together, what we feel is lift. And it maximizes flexion. So the horse becomes very stable and very lifted. So those are the 5 basic functions of the spine. And I'm going to go over those. We're going to go through and look at it piece by piece and what constitutes imbalance, pieces of balance, and then how it all comes together for basic balance and high balance, higher level of balance. So this is the horse's skeleton, and the little blurb that's written, you can pause and read that. But basically, we have to understand basic biomechanics. This is just very rudimentary functions of the spine. We need to know enough to understand that when we lose steering, it's not a behavioral problem. It's a functional problem within the horse's spine that we need to correct. When our horse is too slow or too fast, it's not a behavioral problem, it's a functional problem of the spine. I go to the spine and the functions of the spine in training for optimal balance because the function of the spine dictates the use of the limbs, and the use of the limbs is reflected, the use of the back and the limbs is reflected in the position of the neck and head. So if we manipulate the head, we don't necessarily get the back. But when we learn to understand the various functions, how they're related to steering and speed and stability and bending, then we can solve the problems without having to blame the horse for struggling. Because usually what we call behavior problems are simply a loss of balance. So what that feels like, what it looks like, and I think you should be able to see the cursor. Here's the skull of the horse. This is the cervical spine. Just inside the shoulder blade is the beginning of the thoracic spine. The thoracic spine includes the rib cage, and the thoracic spine, rib cage, and sternum comprise what's called the thorax. This here is the lumbar spine. Behind the last rib starts the lumbar spine, and just where the pelvic bone comes up here begins the sacrum. And then the sacrum transitions into the coccyx, and the coccyx goes right down through the tail. The pelvic bone is here at the top of the leg bones. The scapula, or the shoulders, as we refer to a lot in riding, are here, laying over the thoracic spine. So these three segments, major three segments of the spine, I illustrate the lines of force, how we feel it as a rider. So when I talk about alignment, I'm going to show you the box, the ball, and the T. Now the box, the ball, and the T are basically mapping out. The T is the line of the cervical spine, and crossing that, or in a T-junction to that, is both of the front limbs that we feel through the shoulders. Because the base of the neck and how it's used influences the direction of the shoulders, whether they shift left and right, or whether they remain upright and stable. Then the ball is basically the thoracic spine. It kind of feels like a ball. It moves like a ball. Rotation is the feeling of the ball rolling. And that's the dorsal tips of the spine shifting left and right. So that's where the rider sits, is over the thoracic spine, which I illustrate in the next slide as a ball. Then the box that's illustrated in the next slide is the lumbar, the sacrum, and the pelvic bones. So that's a huge origin of stability for the horse, and it sort of moves and shifts like a box. So these three shapes are basically illustrating the cervical spine, then how the cervical spine influences the shoulders, both front legs, then the thoracic spine, which is where the rider sits, is where the star is, and how it is likely to move. And then the box is the lumbar, the sacrum, and the pelvis. So these three shapes together, when I talk about alignment, I drew a line surrounding it so you could kind of see the overall shape of the horse, whether it's tracking on a straight line or a turn. Basic alignment means these three segments of the spine would have a center line, and you would have an equal sensation of mass on either side. So in other words, the pole and the head have a direct straight line back here to the tail, straight through under the saddle, between the rider's legs, under the rider's seat bones. The shoulders should feel stable and upright. The ball should feel level and equal, and the box should feel level and square. So when I talk about alignment, it's this center line of the spine within these three different sort of ways of moving. So if you imagine how a T could move, it would be a different sort of movement than a ball, which would also be different than a box. And these three shapes just describe the capacity, or sort of how each segment of the spine gains and loses balance or proper function. So what does it look like in real pictures, a real horse, when they lose alignment? So the top left picture here with a rider, you can look down and see the horse's legs are crossing in front. The horse is sort of pushing the rider over to the left and pushing a shoulder over to the right. So that's a loss of alignment, not a bad one, but you can see there's resistance for the horse to turn from the rider. So that resistance often gets labeled as behavior when really the horse has lost alignment. Restoring the alignment and maybe then turning might be a better idea if alignment couldn't be regained on the turn. Here, the horse doing groundwork with the saddle on, you can see more obviously sort of the neck and head is going one way, the shoulders are going the opposite way, and the hindquarters are kind of going in the same direction as the neck and head. So for a quadruped, 4 legs with a long neck and a heavy head, they can adjust those different segments of the spine to counterbalance when they're out of ideal function or optimal function. They can sort of move the box, the ball, and the tee to counteract each other, so that even though they're completely out of balance, they're not physically falling over, or maybe not even stumbling. So that's what it's like to have 4 legs with a long neck and a heavy head that can kind of counter a little bit of loss of balance. In the lower pictures, it's just a horse playing in the field. But again, some good examples of how the shoulders are sort of falling out of line with the hips, and then the head and neck is countering that. Then here's some pictures of horses with proper alignment, stabilizing the alignment. So between the rider's legs and arms, the rider also has to have their alignment. The rider's alignment is vertical with gravity. The horse's alignment is horizontal to gravity. But you can see when there is the proper alignment, even though these horses in the pictures are a little bit on the forehand, they're still lined up through the 3 major segments of their spine, which then lines up the legs. So in this picture here, you can see how the horse is tracking with the front legs in front of the hind legs. Same thing in this little picture over here of just the legs. Then with a rider, what alignment gives you is a decontraction of the back. Instead of contracting the neck, shortening the muscles, lifting the head, or contracting the back muscles down, the alignment, the proper alignment of the spine, ironically gives us suppleness of the muscles. When we overbend the spine, we create rotation issues and we create compensation patterns. So if we bend the cervical spine too far out of line with the thoracic spine, or the horse's hindquarters are too far misaligned from the front legs or the forelimbs, then that is what creates muscular tension. Because as soon as the spine is in stress, the muscles will kick in to create stability. So here was my best attempt to try to describe rotation in 2 dimensions, but we're back to our box, our ball, and our tee. Excuse me. So in this illustration, our reins really influence the tee. So our reins are part of stabilizing the shoulders, stabilizing the neck to be in a proper alignment to the thoracic spine and the ball, and that has to be properly aligned to the lumbar sacrum pelvis in the box. So around the green ball and the red box, I drew a line that's basically the torso of the horse. Almost separately in your mind, you can think of the neck and the line of the front legs more like a triangle that has to line up to the torso. Then we have rotation problems. So this horse in this example is the cervical spine is too far to the right, which is going to drop the right shoulder and push the left shoulder to the left. So the right shoulder will be lower and closer. So the front right leg, instead of stepping away from the midline to make the next step on a turn, that leg is going to step towards the midline, and the left front leg will push outward. We call that escaping through the shoulder, dropping the shoulder, pushing the shoulder. That's what we call it. But basically, it's beginning a rotation problem, because as soon as the cervical spine is that far, the thoracolumbar spine is what I was going to say, but the thoracic spine, which is just the ball, is going to protect the spinal cord by putting the dorsal tips of the spine in what's called inverted rotation. So the energy of the barrel with the neck too far right, the energy of the barrel is going to be pushing up on the rider to the right and shifting the barrel. Well, I guess the barrel could go left or right. But in this example, the barrel energy is going too far left with the shoulder, and the rider is being seated too far to the right. Right? So the horse is dropping the shoulder and lowering the rider. So this is just one possible example. It's a body. It can do a lot of different things. But the point is, misalignment is going to be coupled with a rotation problem. And that's going to travel back to the box, where the right hind leg is going to take a longer stride forward, and the left hind leg is going to be blocked by the barrel and take a shorter stride. And the right hip will be higher. Sorry, the left hip will be higher with a shorter stride. The right hip would be lower with a longer stride compared to the left. So some real examples of that would be this. So here in the upper left corner is a horse with the neck too far to the left, and this is a classic inverted rotation. The dorsal tips of the spine are going right, the neck is too far left, the dorsal tips of the spine are going right, the horse's back muscle is contracting on the left. So the horse's back is pushing the rider up on the left seat bone, and gravity is sort of pulling the rider down on the left. It's even taking the saddle off to the right. And then the horse's hindquarter is not quite centered either. It's sort of cocked a little bit over towards the left. The left hind leg is going to be taking a shorter stride. So even though it's not super obvious in this picture, the left side would be higher. The left hind leg would take a shorter stride. The right hind leg would take a longer stride and bear the brunt. In the picture just below it with the stripes, almost the exact same thing, but the horse's head and neck is in a different position. But the rider is still being seated to the right, pushed up on the left. And actually it's the same in all of these photos. The rider's being dropped on the right side, pushed up on the left side. So we have 3 photos where we can see the back of the rider, and this last photo in the corner is a front view of the rider. So you can see, even though the rider thinks they're straight, one thigh bone is higher than the other. If we take it down to the calves, you can see with her half chaps that they're not quite level to the ground, and her feet are unlevel. Somebody would say, hey, your stirrups are uneven, or you might think your stirrups are uneven, or the horse is obviously starting to take the saddle and the pads over to the right. So the rider is unaware of this because our brains can normalize anything. So these riders feel equal on their seat bones, equal weight, and equal weight in their stirrups. And so they're allowing their bodies to go with the horse. So we have to have a different perspective of how we balance. How we're trained to feel our feet with equal weight or our seat with equal weight doesn't serve us on a horse. None of us ride a horse that's in perfect balance. It doesn't exist. So we all have to find out, how do we balance ourselves in the moment that a horse has a rotation problem. And the way we do that in these pictures is, even though in all 4 of these pictures, even though the horses are still having a rotation problem, they're not level, the hindquarter is not square, the shoulders are not lined up to the hind legs or front limbs with the hind legs, the necks are probably overbent, whether you can see them or not. But in these photos, what's different is the rider is aligned to gravity. So they won't feel in these situations level on their seat bones, equal on their seat bones if we talk about weight. What I look for in myself is my seat bones being level to each other. So I feel the upward force that back here, people compensate by bending the rib cage, right? That's a classic one, dropping the shoulders, making the shoulders unlevel. Or here, she's staying straight and her whole torso is tipping. Here in this rider, you can almost see through her hands that she's contracting through her shoulders. That comes from the instability of the rider's seat over gravity. So here, it's a bit of a brain burner. We call it a helmet fire. When you start to realize that you never feel equal weight until the horse is actually in balance. So this is how we correct rotation. At the same time, we're creating through our arms and legs a straight line from pole to tail down the middle of the horse internally. Has nothing to do with steering yet. So this rider is going to feel a lot more upward force on her left seat bone. So even though visibly she looks straight to us, what these riders are feeling, and this one the same thing, a lot more force on her left seat bone, maybe no horse under her right seat bone in this case. And this one is in a rise of the rising trot. It's the same thing. We still have to control our body so that we are vertical to the ground through our alignment, through our head, our back, our pelvis, through our seat bones, and that we're level through our pelvis, kind of through the thigh bone to thigh bone relationship. They should be symmetrical, equal. That's when our seat is level. And when we do that in our axial skeleton, which is the skull, the spine, and the pelvis, when we keep that vertical line and we resist being tilted left to right, that is how we correct the rotation problem in the horse. Because we are weight and mass, it's not a leg aid or even what I would consider a seat aid. It's just keeping your alignment and your balance when the horse is losing theirs. That's the correction to the problem. So we have alignment and rotation, which are both related to steering, straightness. This is an example of longitudinal extension, or I just call it the posture of extension. The illustration is pretty extreme, but we can have different versions of this. Any version of it means the same thing. So the horse's thoracolumbar spine, from full extension to full flexion, only has a range of motion of 55 millimeters. But in that 55 millimeter range of motion, it's never static. It's never neutral. It's either going towards extension or towards flexion. So in this kind of extreme version of extension, the black line here is at 0 degrees. So a horse's balance is the center of their torso, not the neck and head. The center of their torso should be parallel to gravity. So this line, black line at 0 degrees, I just sort of put through, and you can picture this when you look at horses. You can picture this line in your imagination and put it right through the center of the horse. And it gives you a very quick way to view the posture of the horse, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. So in this posture of extension, this is where the spine is pushing down ventrally. The red lines I drew, I started at the pole, and I followed the line of the cervical vertebra, which went, the pole is the highest point, and sometimes that's what we're told. Just get the pole to be the highest point of the neck and you're good to go. That's how they balance. Well, they can have the pole, which is basically C1, C2, and into the joint of C3, is called the pole. So they can have the pole at the highest point of their neck and be an extension, and they can have the pole at the highest point of their neck and be in flexion. So we have to know the difference. An extension is the posture of fight and flight. It's the instinctual posture, the go-to posture when they are trying to do what you're asking them to do, but they don't have the balance for it. So recognizing extension and what it feels like is very important because it comes up over and over and over in the process of developing a horse. And a lot of people will get stuck here because it can mimic some of the feelings of flexion, because extension is the instinctual way for the body to have immediate access to power. Over the long term, it's debilitating. It will create unsoundness and ill health and or behavioral problems. So a lot of behavioral problems will be related to this posture. It's physiological. So, sorry, let me get back to what I was saying. From the pole, I drew a straight line of force down through the cervical spine and then sort of followed the middle of the torso. What does that line look like compared to our line of the horizon at 0 degrees? Right? Then I just connected it back. And I found that interesting. I left it. I've never done that before, but I left that because I went, wow, that's exactly what it feels like. If you're the rider on this horse, the energy of the horse is pushing backwards against the rider. So what the rider feels is a backwards force rather than a forward flow. So when a horse is in any version of this posture, you're going to have a rotation problem as a side effect. The side effect of the spine going into extension, longitudinal extension, is hyperrotation. If the hyperrotation, a very quick back and forth of the dorsal tips of the spine, if that's not stabilized, then over time, the horse will misalign the hindquarters, the neck, the forehand as a way to find stability. Because this function of the spine not only makes the rider incredibly unstable, there's a lot of instability coming, a lot of movement, a lot of excessive movement that comes into the saddle as forces against the rider. So over time, that's exactly what the horse becomes, is unstable in their movement, walk, trot, canter with steering. You're also going to have, so you have a rotation problem as a known side effect of extension, which can lead to a misalignment of the spine in the horse seeking stability because they're losing stability. And you're definitely going to have a speed issue. The speed issue could be that you don't have enough forward and you're having to drive every step. The horse has no impulse to carry you forward, or the horse is rushing forward, not necessarily running away with you, but this is what they look like when they run away with you. But either kind of the feeling of an out of control forward, which can be at the walk, the trot, the canter. You just feel the horse doesn't have a lot of control. Or it can be rushing, it can be too fast, it can border on running away with you. And if we control it with the bit, but we don't change the function of the spine, it perpetuates. The problem is the function of the spine. That's the root cause, so that's where we try to go to remedy that. So extension is a natural posture for the horse. It's a fight-flight posture. It's the posture of instinct. We don't want it when we're riding a horse. It doesn't serve the horse. It's not easy to ride, but even if you can ride it, and you're not afraid of speed or you're not frustrated by no forward, it still is the posture that will lead to lameness, health issues, if not also behavioral problems. So recognizing it and knowing how to get out of it is very important in the path of developing optimal balance in your horse. So here's some extension problems. And I did this specifically. This was one ride with a horse in training. The upper left-hand corner is her in extension, kind of extreme. She has a lameness issue, calcification on the right front. I have videos of her as a case study. And she was getting dangerous to ride. The owner was afraid to ride her, so she was with me in training. And this was very typical of the early rides, extreme extension. And she was not the safest horse to ride. In this same ride, these are all versions of extension from extreme in the upper left to less extreme in the upper right, where she still is in the same use of her muscles, the same use of the bones or the skeleton. So we're not going to develop that horse, even if I have obedience and I can go and do a show. If she's in this use of her body, the posture I call extension, then you're still developing the nervous system patterns, the habits of movement, and the muscle development to support that posture. As soon as we get out of this posture, even here it gets better, but we're still in it. The lower left is a more mild version of the same posture, and then the lower right is of the mildest version, but still in the same posture. It's still a problem. The muscle use, the function of the skeleton, how she's organizing her movement, we haven't yet gotten out of extension yet. So that was a problem. So the first step out of extension, the way out of extension is stabilize the rotation, keep the alignment. So the straightness is actually the way out of extension. We sort of think as humans that if extension is the problem, flexion is the solution. But in practical terms, I don't find it's easy to get out of extension directly into flexion. So I fix the side effects of extension, which is I create the internal alignment, I stabilize the rotation with the use of my body, and the first step out of extension, which is dynamic. As the spine becomes more stable in a healthy alignment, more stable in the element of rotation, the reflex, the dynamic sort of reflex of the horse, is to release the shortening, contracting, tight muscles of the top line, the back, the neck, and the hindquarter. So what happens is at the very same rate that the spine becomes more stable, better aligned, and more stable in the element of rotation, the back muscles come out of what's called concentric contraction, which is a shortening of the muscle fibers and contraction. It's an overuse of the muscles because the spine is unstable. So as you stabilize the spine, the muscles release the excessive contraction naturally. You don't force them to do it. It just tells you you're getting where you want to go. So these are all different versions of a horse that's just coming out of extension. In the upper left-hand corner, this horse came out of extension. It was pretty chronic. He's an Andalusian. He came out of extension and he wanted to stop and think about it. So every time he came out of extension, he would sort of halt, and I would just take my time, give him a minute, and then let him try to go forward without going back into extension. So the long and low is kind of the first step out of extension. It's not balance. It's just telling you you're getting out of extension. So now the muscle use is going to change, the function of the spine is going to change, everything's going to change. But you're not really problem-free. It's only the first step. This horse, which I showed in the 4 different versions of extension in the very same ride, this was what she did when she came out of extension. She pulled me forward, she ripped her head down, she ripped the rein down, and her answer in long and low was to go faster and faster and faster. This horse's answer in long and low was to stop. Right? This horse in the lower right corner is also coming out of extension, but immediately dropping the pole. Dropping the pole is the same as long and low. The horse is still falling forward because they don't immediately have the coordination to control their body weight from falling forward when they first learn to release the excessive contraction of the back, the neck, and the top of the hindquarter, which had been how they were stabilizing their body. So as you transition to the skeletal coordination of the spine, they release the muscular tension and almost immediately fall forward into long and low. So you can expect it. Long and low is the result of just coming out of chronic extension. And even if we don't allow long and low and we wanted balance, so this horse, which is just standing there on the ground, I picked this picture because it's a great example of good basic balance. Ideally, if our horse came out of extension, they would still lengthen the back muscles, lengthen the neck muscles away from the rider. The pole would be at the same level as the withers, and the horse would feel more stable. This would be sort of ideal. If they could come out of extension and land here, that would be great. Not all of them do that. So this horse comes out of extension and drops the pole. So the torso is still headed forward and down, but the horse is getting behind the pressure of the bit as a way to fall forward and not have bit pressure. This horse goes, I can take bit pressure and the rider. I'm just going to rip my head down, and when she would rip her head down, she would go faster. This horse would rip his head down, want all the reins, but he would also want to stop. So long and low, let me be very clear, is not balance. It is not stretching. The straightness creates the suppleness. So getting the alignment and the rotation stable internally of the horse supples the back muscles, lengthens the neck muscles, which also supples. So they're coming out of concentric contraction and lengthening the muscles. When they do that, they're releasing a lot of old patterns. So it's not the worst thing, but it's not balance and it's not stretching. Long and low is actually falling forward. Way too much weight on the front end. They can't engage the hind end very well. So it's a temporary thing. If the horse has been chronically in extension, then I go, okay, I might allow it for a short time, let the body adapt, and then move towards basic balance. So the same diagram, like I did for extension, I started with the red line at the pole, followed the line of the cervical vertebra, followed the center of the torso, and then I followed that wrong with my cursor. Here's the pole. I followed the line of the cervical vertebra. That was here. Then I followed the line here, the center of the torso, and then I reconnected it. So the energy was down instead of up, and you can see the center line of the horse is high in the croup, or the hindquarter, and low towards the shoulders. So the torso is slanting forward and down. The neck is going forward and down with it. Okay, that might be okay if you just this moment got out of extension and the muscles need to adapt a little bit from being in chronic concentric contraction. So the suppleness or what people would consider stretching happens before the head goes long and low, not after. So getting long and low is not necessarily a stretch. The suppleness of the back and lengthening of the neck is the result of the stability coming into the spine. When the skeleton gains stability in the proper coordination, there's no need for the chronic excessive muscular contraction, holding, tightness, soreness, etc. So the other version of long and low, which we see a lot, is this. Okay, maybe the horse is out of extension. Oh, whoops, I skipped a step back here. So this posture, long and low, but I didn't write long and low. That's what we all call it. I just call it out of extension, but definitely needs more flexion. This might be the end of extension or the rudimentary beginning of flexion because the spine is never neutral, but it's not a balanced posture. It's just out of extension would be the best thing I could say about it. If they stay here long term, you have a whole new set of contractions and problems and usually front leg lamenesses. So this is another version of long and low, which is out of extension, but needs more flexion, and usually this head position is taken by the horse because they are telling you it's too much bit pressure for them. It doesn't matter if your reins are incredibly light. It could be a memory or just unique to that horse. But when they put the face behind the vertical and the pole is lower than C3, then that's called behind the vertical, dropping the pole, getting behind the bit, It is not a proper head and neck position. It's very stressful to all the muscles, tendon, and ligament up around the skull and upper cervical vertebra, which can really do some damage to their movement. It can really impede their balance and their movement to have this much stress up there. So again, here's our horizontal line to gravity. Here's our pole, and this made a very interesting shape because when the horse is trying to avoid bit pressure, if you let go of the reins and don't keep a short rein, they will more than likely fall into long and low because that's where the torso is going. When we keep the pressure on the bit or the rein short, thinking we're framing the neck and head or getting collection through the neck and head, then the pole is here, and I have to go up from the pole, up and back from the pole to follow the line of the cervical spine, and then down. Then I follow the line of the thoracolumbar spine back to the pelvis and the center of the horse, and you can see the croup is high, the shoulders are low. Then when I reconnected it, I found this fascinating because that is sort of the damage it can do to the neck and head. Cervical spinal arthritis, severe tightness, headaches, TMJ problems, jaw issues, all kinds of issues because their neck is definitely not meant to be hyperflexed here, right? It's an indication. It means the same thing as long and low. The horse is on the forehand, so you don't have collection when the pole is dropped and C3 or the upper middle of the neck is higher. And I thought this diagram of energy by following the line of the spine was really fascinating. It doubles back on itself. And again, you can have the problem of too much forward, not enough forward, right? So flexion is related to speed. Then we're going to go to finally what we are looking for. What we are looking for is basic balance as a minimum. So basic balance equals stability. And maybe not 100% stable, but definitely easier to ride when the horse is in this spinal function, which is actually basic balance and stability is kind of an equation. It's more flexion or out of extension. We moved out of long and low. We moved out of dropping the pole by adjusting the speed, either braking or pushing, which I'll go into another time. But to get flexion, elevation of the pole, whether it's out of long or low, or it's a dropped pole, is related to speed. And we have to throw away our concept that faster creates more lift, or even that slower is better. The back muscles do the job of braking, B-R-A-K-E, and pushing, or managing forward force. The hind legs do the pushing, and they help with the braking. So the back muscles working in harmony between the forward thrust and control or stabilizing the forward thrust, which would be also the ability to make a downward transition without rein pressure. Your upward transition, downward transition should be equal, easy, and light without relying on bit pressure, particularly for the downward transitions, and not having to make the horse go forward every step, right? So when you balance the forward and the ability to stop, that's what creates the flexion or increases the flexion through the spine, longitudinal flexion. So this is the posture I call basic balance, which means we've adjusted the speed to increase the flexion through the thoracolumbar spine, which then elevates the neck and elevates the pole through speed, not reins, out of long and low, out of a dropped pole, into the posture of long and level. So now from our pole at the highest point, the line of force of the cervical spine goes down, and then this line through the thoracolumbar spine and pelvis is now parallel to our 0-degree line of gravity. Then I can connect it back, and there you see sort of the diagram of forward and up, right? It's a forward and up is how they balance. That's where the forces go. Mechanically, biomechanically, the spine might be moving up and back, but the line of force we feel is the way forces are managed are forward and up. I know it's a bit backwards. I won't get you too confused. So what does basic balance look like? Here's my horse in training again on a different ride as she's improving her balance. It's long, I call it long and level instead of long and low because we want long, yes, low, no. Yeah, long, yes, low, no. So the neck muscles lengthening away from the rider as we're adjusting the speed. And here you can see in the early stages of it, there's quite a bit of force on the reins. She's pulling on me. Falling, I'm not pulling her head in. I'm using the reins to help with the straightness of the neck, trying to control the rotation with my body. There, as she comes out of whatever, either extension or long and low, she still has a little too much weight on the front end. So there's a little bit of rein pressure there, but I'm opening my arms and my hands and letting it go. Same thing here. I'm letting the reins go, but she's sort of pulling down. Her neck is long. We're starting to see a more level line through the middle of her torso. It's still a little downhill. The pole is starting to become level to the withers. So long and level, we could call this posture, but I go in basic balance. We're looking visually. From the seat, we can see the neck lengthening away from us. That's long. Level is the feeling or the visual from the side of the torso, level or parallel to the ground, not aiming downward in front of us towards the ground. Then you also feel stability in the saddle and lightness in the reins, lightness on the bit. There's no heaviness involved when you truly get the flexion of the spine. So we could say long, level, light on the bit, and stable in the saddle. That would kind of describe the feeling of basic balance. So here in the lower two, she's getting lighter on the reins. In this last picture, you can see the reins are slack, but she's holding that posture. She's starting to reach farther forward with her front legs as they become less loaded. When the hind legs and the hind quarter and the back muscles are doing the job of braking, that's what controls her body weight. So as she pushes with the hind legs, that creates the forward energy, but then immediately they have to balance that with braking or stabilizing the body weight and the forward force. Otherwise, it just falls with gravity forward and down to their own front legs. So muscularly, when they flex the spine, the muscles are in eccentric contraction, which means lengthening and contracting. So the length is important, but not long and low. Long and level, light and stable. And what's so interesting about this is once we achieve basic balance, which is really the whole point of what I teach, is trying to overcome the gazillion different ways that they can go out of balance. Stabilizing a rider, no matter what the horse throws at you, is important. But the goal is long and level. This is basic balance. So basic balance in the walk, in the trot, in the canter, on left turns and right turns and straight lines and circles and in lateral work. So that's what training for optimal balance is in the physical part of balance for the horse. It's going to involve the rider, guaranteed. The horse can't get there without a very balanced and stable rider. But what's interesting about this line of force that I drew is here, all the muscles are now beginning to work to strengthen this function of the spine. That's important. You might not be at a competitive speed for whatever your sport is. Your horse is too fast or too slow. It's not collected enough for higher levels of sport. It's fine if you're a trail rider, if basic balance is just the minimum to keep your horse healthy and sound. It's the best use of their body, no matter what you do with them. it should be in this posture, should be there in walk, in trot, in canter, on circles, on turns, on straight lines, all the time, not sometimes, on trails, uneven ground, with distractions, blah, blah, blah. The goal is to habituate this use of the body, which has a mechanical function of the spine, supported by all the hard and soft tissues. So in this posture, the joints are now going through a healthy range of motion throughout the entire body. The muscles are supple and becoming strong. The horse's behavioral problems absolutely just melt away. By the time you get to this posture, you don't have behavioral problems anymore. And the horse loves the work. They look forward to the ride. They love the work because it benefits them. They feel that. So from basic balance to, there's the sample, to what would be called advanced balance or higher balance or collection, right? It's the same line of force. I had to place the pole here because my artist, who is just drawing what she sees, gave me a horse that I asked for in advanced balance with a drop pole. I went, okay, I'm not going to complain too much. She basically got it pretty good, other than she let the pole be dropped. The pole of the horse should actually be here. She got the face on the vertical. The head hangs when the whole body is doing the right thing. So on the vertical is part of what we look for, but we don't create it through the reins. It is the result of the stability and the control and the balance of the thoracolumbar spine up through the cervical spine. So the pole achieving the highest point and the head hanging on vertical is the result of all the stability and force management that goes on in their back and their hindquarter. And I found it very interesting. It was sort of a surprise when I was playing with this drawing tool that when I started the pole at the highest point of the neck, follow the cervical line down, then through the center of the thoracolumbar spine and reconnect it. It's the same shape as basic balance. So here in basic balance, it's just not as lifted, right? The other thing that's a big surprise is people are looking for maybe a shape, when we say lift the back, that the upward force is going to sort of be the opposite of extension, which is extension is sort of like a hole in the horse's back. They're thinking it should be like a rainbow shape in the horse's back. It isn't. A truly lifted spine still remains parallel to the horizontal line. So the center of the horse is still parallel. It's not tipped backwards and up in front. The energy is going forward and up. So when they say it feels like you're going uphill, they don't mean that the saddle is high in front, low in back. That would be a version of imbalance. In true balance, they still feel parallel to the ground, but the flexion is maximized. So they feel light everywhere, like they defy gravity. The front legs are pushing upward, the hind legs are doing the job of braking and stabilizing along with the back as well as propelling. So the thoracolumbar spine is still, the line of force through the center of the horse's body is parallel to the ground, but higher. So the neck is still in length, just like basic balance, out of extension. So this is where it gets confused with extension a lot, because you can think you have this posture, but if the neck muscles, if the pole is dropped, or the pole is the highest point, but it's pushing back towards the rider, or the neck muscles are shortening, bulging outward, or the neck is contracting back towards the saddle, those are versions of neck use when the thoracolumbar spine is in extension. So flexion, you still have long, but now you have long muscles and lift. So it's long, lifted, and light, and stable. So all of those same things that we search for in basic balance are still true at a higher level of balance, more advanced balance. That's why it's important to get basic balance right. If you truly get basic balance and you know what that feels like, Number one, your horse is going to love it because it brings ease to their job of carrying a rider and restores health. If you have a lame horse or a difficult horse, it's the way out of that. And if you have a performance horse with great conformation and great movement, it enhances it. And it keeps the horse sound for higher level athletic endeavors. Right? So then what does that look like? Okay, these are both my mentors. These larger pictures here on the gray horse with the cowboy. This is John Strong. John Strong didn't really teach, didn't give clinics. He trained horses, but not really for anybody but himself, and he bred Arabians. This is my Arabian sire. The horse's name is Cirrus, and it was one of John's stallions for breeding, and he trained Cirrus, took him as a colt, trained him, and used him for breeding. So I love these pictures, especially in Western gear, straight up in the bridle with a spade bit, and he rode with a bosalito, which is very classical vaquero-style Western riding. And this Arabian, he was a big Arabian because John's not a small guy. And even with John's legs stuck out in front of him here, giving him some kind of cue, John's axial skeleton is still pretty vertical to the ground. He was a great rider and a very sensitive rider. So here, with slack in the reins, you can see the horse here is in the walk, very light on the front end, right? The neck lengthening, the poll high, not quite on the vertical. John's a little heavy in his seat. Maybe it could be a bit better, but it's pretty light, very lifted. If we look through the center line of the horse, through the center of the torso, it's pretty parallel to the ground. This is on a turn, a Western turn, where the horse has both front feet off the ground. He's asking for not a spin, but just like a cow working turn, but a very dramatic one. So here as he's turning, John's balance is very good. Again, very loose reins, working off of the rider's seat. And here, even though the line is slightly backwards, which some people think is what a collection should feel like, I go, well, okay, but his front feet are off the ground. He can't really do that in motion. He can do that in a rear, he can do that on a turn, but he can't do that in forward motion. So that's the only time the line is lower behind and more lifted in front. But if we look at all the power and the elegance, that's what true mechanical sound function of the spine brings. Then in this lower right-hand corner, I sort of stole this off the internet, but this is Jean-Luc, who I worked with for many years on his horse Chazot. And Chazot is in the snaffle on a very, very light rein, and this horse, Chazot, is in the trot. And you can see he's very square, the center line of his body very parallel to the ground, the neck lengthening and the energy going forward and up. The head hanging on the vertical, not restricted by the reins. The front legs light. The legs are what we call square. So this leg that's in stance is in vertical directly under the shoulder. That's the transition between braking and pushing. This front leg over here, the left front leg, is pushing upward, not pushing backward. That's a large part of the upward force we feel in collection. I think 58% of the vertical force is created from the front limbs. 42% or 43% something is created from the hind limbs. Here we see this leg in flexion. The other one we can't see, which is in stance, so we can't quite see if it's square. But this leg is coming forward closer to the midline of the body, nicely engaged. So both of these mentors taught me a lot. And I love these pictures because, as you can tell, I'm ending the slideshow without really going into lateral flexion. I'm going to save that for another time, because when I talk about lateral bending, there's a lot of concepts to go over. But to understand lateral bending, you have to understand these other four functions. And I picked these pictures of horses in very high balance one in a snaffle, the other in a spade bit with a bosalito, but really no rein contact. And these horses are not being asked for lateral bending. The poles are straight, but they still have an amazing amount of lift. So it's just sort of to show that you don't need lateral bending to have supple, powerful, very well balanced, elevated, flexed horses. So another time I will go into the lateral bending, but this is quite a long video or slideshow, so I am going to wrap it up here. And thank you very much for joining me today.